Grant Walker was a man who had chosen peace, a decorated veteran who had left his Army Ranger uniform behind, swearing he would never use his combat skills again. He simply wanted to be a father, to live quietly, and to protect Emma from the violent world he knew so well. But when he saw a young Marine being harassed by 3 colleagues in a crowded restaurant where everyone else simply looked away, Grant faced an impossible choice: uphold his promise of peace or stand up for someone who couldn't defend herself. In that moment, with his daughter watching and the entire town bearing witness, he had to decide what honor truly meant and the price he was willing to pay for it. If this story moved you, please leave a like, share it with veterans and family members who understand this burden, and subscribe for more stories of men and women who chose to do the right thing when no one else would. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to the beginning. Grant Walker pushed open the diner's glass door with his right hand, holding Emma's hand firmly with his left, feeling the small, trusting warmth of her fingers intertwined with his. It was Saturday morning, and the sunlight poured through the wide windows, reflecting off the worn red leather booths and the rusty metal chairs that had seen generations of families come and go. The thick scent of fresh coffee mixed with frying bacon and pancakes filled the air, and Grant took a deep breath, trying to let that simple aroma erase any lingering burden he carried from the previous years. He wanted this to be just another ordinary day, no tension, no past, nothing but a quiet breakfast with his daughter. Emma looked up at him with those bright brown eyes, smiling as if the whole world was safe, and Grant smiled back, feeling his chest tighten with a mix of love and responsibility that still scared him sometimes. The waitress greeted them with a quick nod and showed them to a table near the window, where the light hit the faded Formica tabletop directly. Grant pulled out a chair for Emma, helping her climb up while she clutched the worn teddy bear she insisted on taking everywhere. And then he sat down facing the door, as he always did, not even realizing he was still following that old habit of always keeping the exit in his field of vision. The diner was full but not loud, the kind of quiet bustle of a small town, where everyone knows everyone and no one needs to shout to be heard. There were families with small children, an elderly couple sitting in comfortable silence, and a few young Marines on leave scattered at the back tables, wearing civilian shirts but still carrying that rigid posture and characteristic haircut that gave away who they were. Grant glanced at them, but quickly looked away, focusing on the laminated menu that Emma was already flipping through curiously. Emma pointed to the photo of a giant plate of pancakes with strawberries and whipped cream, and Grant chuckled softly, shaking his head as he said she could order whatever she wanted, as long as she promised to eat it all. She nodded with exaggerated seriousness, and he felt that tightness in his chest again, that feeling that every simple moment like this was worth more than any mission he had ever completed, more than any medal stored in some forgotten box in the closet. He had spent too many years away, in places too hot, doing things too heavy, and now all he wanted was to be here, in this ordinary diner, with his daughter eating pancakes and talking about cartoons. The waitress returned, took their order with friendly efficiency, and disappeared toward the kitchen, leaving Grant and Emma alone again in that bubble of normalcy that he fought every day to preserve. But Grant knew that normalcy, in a town like this, was always fragile. The Marine Corps' base was less than 15 minutes away by car, and the presence of the Marines shaped everything from the businesses that depended on military money to how the local community handled any conflict involving service members. There was a silent, almost automatic respect, but also an equally silent fear of getting involved in trouble that might escalate back to the base. Grant knew that dynamic well, because he had once been a part of it in a different way, in another place, in another uniform. He discreetly observed the movement around them, noticing how civilians kept a polite distance from the groups of Marines, how conversations lowered their tone when they passed, how even the waitress slightly changed her posture when serving their tables. It wasn't hostility, it was recognition of hierarchy, of power, of a social order that everyone accepted without question. Emma fiddled with the paper napkin, folding it into strange shapes while waiting for the food, and Grant took the opportunity to take a sip of the coffee the waitress had automatically brought, feeling the hot, bitter liquid slide down his throat and awaken something in him that he preferred to keep dormant. He tried to relax, forcing his shoulders down, breathing slowly, reminding himself that he wasn't on a mission, that he didn't need to be alert, that he could simply be a father and nothing more. But the body didn't forget the years of training, the conditioned reflexes, the way his eyes still swept the room at regular intervals, cataloging faces, exits, and unusual movements. He hated it. He hated that he couldn't completely switch off, hated that part of him was still trapped in something he had sworn to leave behind. Emma said something about school, and Grant forced a smile, focusing on her words, on the present. The diner continued its calm and predictable rhythm, with the sound of cutlery clinking against plates, low conversations, and the constant sizzle of the grill in the kitchen. The walls were covered with old photographs of the town, including several of local veterans and service members, serious faces in immaculate uniforms, some with medals pinned to their chests, others just staring firmly into the camera, as if performing another duty. Grant avoided looking at those photos, because they reminded him of something he was trying to forget, something about identity and purpose that no longer made sense to him. He was a father now, only that, and anything else he had been was buried deep, where Emma would never have to see. The food arrived, giant pancakes for Emma and simple scrambled eggs for Grant, and they began to eat in comfortable silence, as the sun continued to stream through the window and the world outside moved on unhurriedly. But something in the atmosphere began to shift, so subtly that Grant barely noticed it at first. It was a movement at the back of the diner, a change in the tone of voices, something that woke his instinct before his conscious mind processed what was happening. He looked back discreetly, just enough to catch the scene without attracting attention, and saw 3 young Marines moving among the tables, laughing too loud, talking too loud, taking up space in a way that seemed deliberate. It wasn't just noise, it was a display of presence, of territorial dominance, the kind that Grant recognized immediately, because he had seen it countless times on military bases around the world. They weren't doing anything illegal, nothing explicit, but their energy changed the environment, making people look away, lower their voices, and pretend not to notice. Grant felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to turn his attention back to Emma, who continued to eat cheerfully, oblivious to everything. Emma licked the syrup from her lips and asked if she could have orange juice too, and Grant nodded, raising his hand to call the waitress, trying to keep everything normal, everything light, everything safe. But his eyes kept returning to the back of the diner, where the tension was growing almost imperceptibly to anyone untrained to notice. The other customers seemed to sense something too, because conversations became even quieter, movements more restrained, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Grant knew that kind of silence. It was the silence of those who witness something wrong but choose not to get involved, of those who prefer to protect their own peace rather than risk confrontation. He understood, rationally, because he did the same thing every day, avoiding any situation that might reactivate the side of him he had sworn never to use again. But understanding didn't make it easier to accept. The waitress brought Emma's juice with a forced smile, and Grant noticed that she was also tense, her eyes darting quickly toward the back of the room before returning to their table. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. Everyone there knew something was about to happen, and everyone was determined to pretend they didn't. Grant picked up his fork again, trying to go back to eating, but the food was tasteless now, and the tightness in his chest returned, stronger because he knew, deep down, that this quiet morning was ending. Emma looked up at him with those big, trusting eyes, and Grant smiled back, praying silently that whatever was happening at the back of the diner wouldn't reach them, that they could finish breakfast and leave before anything shattered the fragile peace he fought so hard to maintain. But life, he knew, was rarely that generous. The diner door opened again, bringing a gust of warm air from outside, along with the metallic sound of the bell hanging on the frame. And Grant instinctively looked up to see who was coming in, still holding his fork in the air as Emma recounted something about her teacher. It was a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail and the erect posture characteristic of someone serving in the armed forces, even while trying to look civilian in jeans and a simple, neutral-colored t-shirt. She paused for a second at the entrance, her eyes scanning the room with that mix of caution and fatigue that Grant recognized immediately, and then headed toward an empty table in the opposite corner, walking too fast, as if she wanted to become invisible. Grant noticed she chose the seat with her back to the wall, facing the door, and knew immediately that she was a Marine, not because she wore any identification, but because everything about her screamed recent training, low hierarchy, and a type of discomfort that came from being constantly watched. Emma continued talking, but Grant realized his attention was divided, part of him still trying to be present with his daughter, part of him observing the woman sitting alone and picking up the menu with hands that trembled slightly. Riley Carson did not want to be there. That was clear from the way she avoided looking around, focusing intensely on the laminated menu as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. Grant knew that behavior. It was that of someone trying not to be noticed, not to be remembered, not to exist long enough to get out of there without incident. She ordered coffee from the waitress in a low, almost inaudible voice, and Grant saw the way her shoulders were tense, as if she expected something bad to happen at any moment. He forced himself to look away, returning to Emma, who was now drawing something on the napkin with the colored pencil she always carried in her small backpack, completely oblivious to the tension that was starting to build in the air. Grant wanted it to stay that way. He wanted his daughter never to have to learn to read those signs, never to have to develop that sixth sense for danger that he carried like a curse. He smiled at her, asking about the drawing, trying to keep the bubble of normalcy intact, but his instincts were awake now, and it was impossible to ignore them completely. It was then that he heard the voices change tone at the back of the diner. It wasn't anything obvious, just a slightly louder laugh, a comment that carried that kind of aggressive energy disguised as a joke, the sound of chairs being dragged more abruptly than necessary. Grant didn't need to look to know it was the 3 Marines he had noticed earlier, but he looked anyway, turning his head just enough to catch the scene without being noticed. They were standing up, moving between the tables with that exaggerated confidence of those who know no one will interfere. And Grant felt his stomach clench when he realized the direction they were heading. They had seen Riley. Of course they had seen her. She was impossible not to notice for anyone looking. And young Marines were always looking, always testing hierarchies, always reinforcing the internal group order through subtle or not so subtle intimidation. Grant quickly lowered his gaze, pretending to be focused on his plate, but every muscle in his body was tense now, prepared for something he prayed wouldn't happen. Emma stopped drawing and looked up at her father with that frightening perception that children sometimes have, as if they feel changes in the air before adults admit something is wrong. She didn't say anything, but her eyes became more watchful, and Grant saw the exact moment she noticed the change in the environment, the way the conversations around them had quieted, how people were avoiding looking in a certain direction, how even the waitress had slowed her movements, pretending to be busy away from the area where the Marines were. Grant took Emma's hand across the table, squeezing lightly, trying to convey security through touch, and she squeezed back, but her eyes kept searching, trying to understand what had made her father so tense. He hated this, hated that she was learning to be afraid, hated that the world was like this, hated that he couldn't simply get up and leave without looking like a coward in his own eyes. The 3 Marines approached Riley's table with that false casualness that fooled no one, especially not Grant, who had seen the same type of behavior hundreds of times on military bases around the world. Chad Frazier was leading the group. Grant didn't know his name yet, but he recognized the type immediately. Too young, too strong, too confident, with that kind of inflated ego that came from recent training and no real combat experience. The other two followed behind like satellites, Jace Hanley and Austin Barton, both built from the same mold, all wearing civilian shirts that didn't hide the muscles worked on base gyms and the regulated haircuts that gave away who they were. They didn't sit down immediately. They stood around Riley's table, taking up space, creating a physical barrier that turned that area of the diner into their territory. Riley kept her eyes on the menu, but Grant saw the way her jaw tightened, how her fingers turned white holding the paper, how she stopped breathing for a second before forcing air into her lungs again. The atmosphere in the diner changed completely. What was once subtle discomfort turned into palpable tension, the kind of energy that makes the air feel heavy and people move slower, as if afraid to draw attention. Grant saw an elderly couple discreetly stand up and pay the bill quickly, leaving through the door without looking back. He saw a mother pull her small children closer, whispering for them to be quiet. He saw other customers turn completely to the opposite side, feigning intense fascination with their food or their cell phones, anything not to witness what was happening. It was the same pattern Grant had seen in dozens of military towns, the local community learning to become blind and deaf whenever internal military conflicts spilled over into civilian spaces, because interfering meant trouble, meant being marked, meant potentially arousing the wrath of an institution much larger and more powerful than any individual citizen. Grant understood the logic, but that didn't make it easier to swallow the bile rising in his throat as he watched all those adults choose silence. Emma pulled her hand away from her father, and when Grant looked at her, he saw fear in his daughter's brown eyes. She didn't understand exactly what was happening, but she felt the tension, she felt the danger, and her child's instinct was screaming that something was very wrong. Grant leaned over the table, keeping his voice low and calm, saying everything was fine, that they would finish eating and leave soon, that she didn't need to worry. But the words sounded hollow even to him, because clearly everything was not fine, and Emma was too smart to believe obvious lies. She looked over her father's shoulder toward Riley's table, and Grant saw the exact moment she registered the scene, the young woman surrounded by the three large men, the body language of intimidation, the way no one was helping. Emma looked back at her father with that expression that broke his heart, that mixture of confusion and hope, as if waiting for the adult to do something, to fix the situation, to prove that the world was just and safe as she had been taught to believe. Grant felt the weight of 1,000 past decisions falling onto his shoulders in that moment. He had left the army precisely to flee this kind of situation, had chosen civilian life precisely not to have to make difficult choices, had sworn to himself that he would never again put Emma in danger or expose her to the violent side of him that had been trained and refined over years of special operations. But now, sitting in that ordinary diner in an ordinary town, he was being forced to choose between keeping his personal promise or doing what was right. He could finish his coffee, pay the bill, take Emma by the hand and walk out without looking back, preserving the fragile peace he had built, protecting his daughter from seeing anything ugly, keeping himself off the military radar he had worked so hard to abandon. Or he could do something and open a door that he had locked and thrown away the key a long time ago. Grant squeezed his eyes shut for a second, taking a deep breath, and when he opened them again, Emma was still looking at him with that expression of hope and fear mixed together. At Riley's table, the situation was clearly escalating, even if silently. Chad Fraser had sat in the chair opposite her without invitation, completely invading her personal space, while the other two remained standing, blocking any escape route. Grant couldn't hear what was being said, but he didn't need to. The body language told the whole story. Riley was trying to remain neutral, probably answering in monosyllables, avoiding eye contact, doing everything she had been taught to do to survive in hostile environments within the military hierarchy. But Grant knew this kind of situation too well, knew exactly how it ended, and knew Riley had no good way out there. If she reacted, she would be accused of disrespect. If she didn't react, the intimidation would only worsen. It was a perfect trap, engineered by years of normalized toxic culture, and everyone in the diner knew it, but no one was going to do anything, because that was the unwritten rule of that town: Marines take care of Marines, and civilians stay out. Emma pulled her father's hand again, harder this time, and when Grant looked at her, he saw tears starting to form in the corners of his daughter's eyes. She was truly scared now, not just by the scene she was witnessing, but by the tension she felt in her father, by the way he was motionless but vibrating with contained energy, like a compressed spring about to be released. Grant realized he had reached the point of no return. Any decision he made now would mark Emma forever, would teach her something fundamental about the world and about who he was as a father and a man. If he did nothing, she would learn that adults lie when they say they protect the weak, that justice is just a pretty word that no one truly practices, that the right thing to do is turn your face and pretend you didn't see. And Grant couldn't accept that. He couldn't accept his daughter growing up believing that cowardice was wisdom, that silence was safety, that preserving personal peace was worth more than defending someone in need. So he squeezed her hand back, forced a smile that he hoped looked confident, and whispered that he would handle it, that she should stay there, that everything would be fine. And when Emma nodded, trusting him completely despite the fear, Grant knew he had just crossed the line he swore he would never cross again. Grant pushed his chair back slowly, trying not to make noise, trying not to draw attention, but every movement seemed amplified in the heavy silence of the diner. Emma held his hand tighter, her large eyes fixed on her father's face, looking for some assurance that everything really would be fine, as he had promised. Grant squeezed back, forcing a smile that he hoped looked confident, and whispered for her to wait there, not to move, that he would be back in a minute. But when he tried to let go of his daughter's hand, she held on even tighter, and Grant saw real fear shining in those brown eyes that were so much like her mother's that it sometimes hurt to look. He lowered himself to her level, placing both hands on her small shoulders, and said with the firmest, calmest voice he could muster that he needed to help that young woman over there, that it was the right thing to do, that she would understand when she was older. Emma nodded, even though she was still scared, because she trusted her father above all else, and Grant felt that familiar weight of responsibility multiply now. He wasn't just protecting a stranger, he was teaching his daughter what it meant to be human. He stood up and began to walk toward Riley's table, each step measured and deliberate, his body automatically falling into that posture that had been trained by years of operations in hostile environments, shoulders relaxed but ready, hands visible but free, expression neutral but alert. Grant could feel every eye in the diner on him now, could feel the silent shock of people who didn't expect anyone to actually do anything. And part of him, the part that had learned to survive by avoiding conflict, screamed at him to stop, go back to the table, grab Emma, and get out of there before it was too late. But the other part, the part that had sworn to protect the defenseless, that had carried a flag and a code of honor for too many years to simply switch off, that part pushed his feet forward, one step at a time, until he was standing a few feet from the table where Riley remained seated, surrounded by the 3 Marines who were now looking at him with a mixture of surprise and irritation at having been interrupted. Grant took a deep breath, feeling his heart beat faster but keeping his face completely calm, and prepared to do something he knew would be irreversible. Chad Frazier was the first to turn completely, his dark eyes sweeping Grant up and down with that kind of automatic assessment that military personnel make when they encounter someone new, checking size, posture, potential threat. Grant saw the exact moment Chad dismissed him as unimportant, just another ordinary civilian, probably a family man without real courage, and that almost brought a bitter smile to Grant's face, because he knew that kind of arrogance very well. That inflated confidence that came from never having faced someone truly dangerous. The other 2, Jace and Austin, didn't even bother to look properly, continuing to block Riley with their bodies, maintaining that relaxed but threatening posture that clearly said they didn't think anyone would be stupid enough to interfere. Rayleigh looked up for the first time, and Grant saw gratitude and fear mixed in that look. Saw someone who had prayed for help, but didn't really expect to receive it. He nodded slightly at her, an almost imperceptible movement, trying to convey that he understood, that he would do what he could, that she was no longer alone. Grant opened his mouth to speak, carefully choosing his words in his mind, trying to find a way to diffuse the situation without escalating the conflict. But before he could say anything, Chad leaned back in his chair with that arrogant smile that made Grant's blood boil, and said something about not needing a civilian babysitter, that they were just talking to a colleague, that Grant should go back to his table and mind his own business. Chad's voice was loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear, marking territory, establishing social hierarchy, reminding everyone that they were the Marines. They were the ones who had power there, and anyone who challenged that would be put in their place. Grant felt his muscles automatically tense, felt that familiar adrenaline starting to run through his veins, but forced himself to keep his voice calm and low when he finally responded, saying he just wanted to make sure everything was okay, that it looked like the young woman wanted to leave and they were blocking her way. It was a simple, direct statement, without accusations, but loaded with meaning that anyone with half a brain could understand. He knew what was happening, and he wasn't simply going to pretend he didn't. The atmosphere changed instantly. Chad's smile disappeared, replaced by a harsher, more dangerous expression, and Grant saw Jace and Austin finally turn completely toward him, forming a semicircle that transformed the situation from psychological intimidation into a real physical threat. They didn't touch him. They didn't need to. The mere presence of the three young, strong, trained, and confident Marines surrounding a civilian who had made the mistake of getting involved where he shouldn't. That was enough for most people to back down. Grant could feel the weight of every eye in the diner, could feel the expectation, the fear, the silent hope that someone would finally do the right thing, but also the terror that it would explode into real violence. He maintained eye contact with Chad, not defiantly but also without backing down. That delicate balance of firmness without aggression that he had learned in dozens of tense negotiations in places much more dangerous than that small-town diner. Riley shifted in her chair, preparing to stand up, and Grant saw Chad casually but deliberately extend his arm, blocking her path, a gesture that clearly said she wasn't going anywhere until they allowed it. It was at that moment that Grant heard Emma's voice, small and frightened but clear enough to cut through the heavy air of the diner like a knife. "Dad, please help her." The words hit Grant with physical force, making his stomach churn and his heart clench, because he knew exactly what that meant. His daughter was seeing injustice happen before her eyes and was begging him to do something, trusting that her father had the power to fix what was wrong, believing that adults protected weak people because that's what adults did. Grant closed his eyes for half a second, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of 1,000 past and future choices converging in that single moment. He could still back down. He could mumble an apology. He could go back to Emma and explain that sometimes adults can't do anything, that the world is complicated, that family safety comes first. But when he opened his eyes and saw Chad looking at him with that victorious smile, that absolute certainty that the civilian would bow and walk away as everyone else always did, Grant knew he wouldn't be able to live with himself if he did that. He took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and the table, and the change in his posture was so subtle yet so complete that even Riley noticed, her eyes widening slightly as she realized something fundamental had changed in the man who had come to help her. Grant was no longer asking, no longer suggesting. He was establishing a line that could not be crossed, and all three Marines felt it too, even if they didn't completely understand what had changed. Grant's voice when he spoke again was different, lower but carrying a weight of authority that had nothing to do with volume or aggression. It was the kind of voice that people train for command use when they know they will be obeyed. He said the young woman was leaving now, that they were going to step aside and let her pass, that this situation was over. It wasn't a request, it wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, said with such calm certainty that for a second even Chad seemed confused about how to respond. But the confusion lasted only a second before ego and arrogance returned, and Chad stood up from the chair with an abrupt movement, facing Grant, invading his personal space the same way he had done with Riley. Jace and Austin moved too, flanking Grant on both sides, and the implicit threat became explicit. They were ready to escalate to physical violence if the stupid civilian didn't know when to back down. Grant didn't move, didn't retreat an inch, and something in his absolute stillness, in the way he seemed completely unintimidated by 3 trained, strong men surrounding him, made Chad hesitate. There was something wrong here, something his military instinct was trying to warn him about. But ego was stronger than instinct, and Chad was about to push Grant or say something that would make the situation explode when Emma called again, her voice breaking in a sob of real fear. "Dad, please." And Grant turned his head slightly, just enough to see his daughter standing beside their table, tears streaming down her face, the teddy bear clutched against her chest, completely terrified, but unable to stay seated while her father was in danger. Grant's heart broke seeing that, seeing his daughter exposed to that situation, seeing the fear in her eyes, knowing that every second of it was recording memories she would carry forever. But it also solidified his determination, because now it wasn't just about doing the right thing, it was about showing Emma that words like courage and honor and protection meant something, that when someone needs help you don't turn your face, that standing on the side of right is worth any cost. He looked back at Chad, and there was something new in his eyes now, something that made even Jace take an involuntary step back, because anyone who had seen real combat recognized that look. It was the look of someone who had crossed an internal line and would no longer retreat no matter what happened. Grant said, in a voice so calm it was almost a whisper, but carrying such deadly certainty that it made the air in the diner seem heavier, that they had 2 seconds to move away from Riley and let her leave, and that if they didn't, he would do it for them. The entire diner seemed to stop breathing. The waitress was frozen near the counter, holding a coffee pot in the air. The elderly couple who hadn't left had wide eyes, hands clasped over the table. Even the sound from the kitchen seemed to have diminished, as if the whole world was waiting to see what would happen next. Riley was looking at Grant with a mixture of hope and terror, wanting to believe he could really protect her, but also afraid of what might happen if he tried. Emma remained standing beside their table, trembling but refusing to sit, her eyes fixed on her father as if he were the only solid point in a world that had suddenly become terrifying and unpredictable. And Grant was there, motionless, calm, waiting to see if the stupid young Marines in front of him had enough sense to realize they had encountered something very different from an ordinary civilian, or if he would have to reveal exactly who and what he was and open a door he had sworn never to open again. Grant did not back down when Chad stood up, even feeling the invisible pressure of the presence of 3 Marines determined not to yield. The diner was plunged into a tense silence, everyone holding their breath, fearing that the calm would be broken by an explosion of violence. Grant smelled the cooling coffee, the sticky texture of the greasy floor under his boots, and the sweat starting to bead on his forehead, not from fear, but from the effort of holding back every trained impulse to respond automatically. It was a silent war waged there, and only those who had been in real conflict knew how much strength it took to remain calm. For an instant, time seemed to stretch, hanging on the invisible thread of a collective decision: surrender to intimidation or put a stop to group pressures. Grant looked Chad directly in the eyes, and in the reflection of the glass behind the Marines, saw Emma watching everything, small and motionless, but full of confidence in her father. With the tension cutting through the air, Riley tried to get up from her chair, gripping her backpack with hands that trembled slightly. Jace blocked her passage with a subtle movement of his body, threatening to create something bigger if she insisted on leaving. She remained seated, body rigid, staring intently at her own leg as if any movement could trigger something irreversible. Grant noticed the contained panic in the young Marine's expression. He knew she had lived through that before, that the silence of the group hurt more than an open blow, that the true poison was in the eyes of the town, everyone pretending nothing was happening. He wanted to say something to encourage her, but he understood that the most powerful gesture would be not to allow her to be isolated ever again. His past, marked by non-negotiable codes of honor, weighed on his back there in the simple act of standing by her side in front of everyone. Chad, feeling challenged, crossed his arms and flashed a sidelong smile, typical of someone who always had the last word in the base hallways or city bars after hours. He mocked the situation, saying it was just a conversation between colleagues, that the civilian didn't need to get involved because this guy clearly doesn't understand how things work. The tone was pure provocation, the voice loud enough for all the clientele to hear and to intimidate anyone else who might consider entering the discussion. Grant didn't let his tone rise. Instead, he spoke softly but clearly. "I understand perfectly when someone is being intimidated. And I understand even more when real adults need to set an example." The words cut through the environment, and even the waitress, standing near the counter, seemed to let out a slight sigh of repressed anxiety. At that instant, the environment that was already under pressure became even more charged, as if a storm were about to hit the small diner without warning. Emma, on the other side, began to cry silently, hugging the teddy bear and glancing at her father. Grant noticed his daughter, felt her anguish, but at the same time knew that backing down at that moment would be teaching all the wrong things about courage and responsibility. He needed to balance the fear of exposing his daughter and the moral duty not to allow injustice. That's when he truly felt the price of every choice, not just for his Ranger past, but because every action from then on would be tattooed on the girl's memory forever. It was no longer about him or Riley, but about the living example before everyone present. Taking a deep breath, Grant tried to resolve the situation with as much control as possible, changing the focus to communication, not physical confrontation, not yet. He asked Riley directly if she wanted to leave, offering her the choice, restoring the only thing the group was trying to deny, her autonomy. Riley, surprised to be heard, looked directly into Grant's eyes and, with a trembling voice, said yes, she wanted to leave. Her answer exposed the true intention of the antagonists. The mask of camaraderie dropped instantly. Jace started to protest, but Chad raised his hand, signaling to wait. He was now the only one responsible for the conflict's escalation in everyone's eyes. Grant, firm, indicated the way out to Rayleigh with a nod, positioning himself so as to protect her in case he needed to act physically. The Marines, realizing they were the center of attention, began to lose their air of invincibility. People at other tables avoided looking directly, but it was impossible for them to ignore the change in atmosphere. Chad, seeing his dominance questioned, verbally threatened Riley, saying that the consequences inside the base would be worse than anything Grant could do there. Grant held back the anger that was growing inside him like a current. He knew the toxicity of group culture, knew that protecting Riley would only be the beginning of a long chain of confrontations. He looked at Emma once more, seeking strength where he always found it, in the love he felt for his daughter and the desire for her to grow up, knowing how to distinguish right from wrong. He was ready to intervene physically if necessary, but he still resisted, betting on moral strength before brute force. It was then that Officer Mercer entered the diner, drawn by the murmurs escaping the glass walls of the place. The officer assessed the scene in seconds, recognizing Grant from other occasions and quickly understanding that an internal military conflict was unfolding there, exactly the type of situation the town did everything to avoid. Mercer hesitated, his hand resting near his holster, but he didn't go straight to the group. He opted for dialogue, calling Chad by name and warning him to avoid scandals, reminding him that they were in a civilian, not a military space. Mercer shot a knowing look at Grant, silently thanking him for the balance, confident that if Grant was involved, he could try to control it without needing brute police force. This public entrance by the officer was enough for a pause to hang in the air, with both sides analyzing whether it was worth continuing to force the tension. In this almost paralyzed scenario, Riley finally managed to stand up, with Grant facilitating the movement by taking a step forward and physically blocking Jace and Austin without actually touching them. The large hands of the two Marines clenched into fists, but Chad's look at Officer Mercer, mixed with Grant's unwavering posture, brought the moment of hesitation that broke the cycle of intimidation. Even so, the humiliation of yielding in front of so many eyes was evident in the antagonist's tense shoulders. Riley left the table, trembling slightly but with her chin raised, and Grant walked alongside her, watching to ensure that none of the three Marines attempted a final act of cowardice. It was a new rhythm for the diner, a silent lesson. It wasn't necessary to shout or use force to defend someone. Sometimes, presence and words were enough. As Grant walked back toward Emma, he felt a mix of relief and exhaustion, but also a deep restlessness, because he knew that this was not the end of the conflict, just a break. Chad's look promised retaliation, and Grant recognized the tactic of someone who was accustomed to never being challenged publicly. That would only be the first round, and the consequences would come later. Riley thanked him softly, her voice choked with nervousness, and Grant calmly instructed her to leave, to find the trusted officer on the base and report everything that had happened. He knew, deep down, that no military system would truly resolve it, but he needed to believe it would give the young woman some chance to protect herself in the future. Grant returned to Emma, kneeling beside his daughter and hugging her tightly, telling her she had been very brave. He whispered that sometimes doing the right thing hurts more than it seems, but that's what makes someone a real person. The diner slowly regained its routine, still under the weight of what they had witnessed. The ordinary man, the quiet father, had just shown the town that courage is not a secret of the uniform, but of character. And Grant knew that, from then on, there would be no easy peace, but judging by Emma's proud and relieved look, he was certain he wouldn't have acted differently, even if he could have. Night fell quickly over the small coastal town, bringing with it a thin fog that enveloped the streetlights and made the air heavier, laden with salty moisture from the ocean. Grant had taken Emma home right after the incident at the diner, trying to comfort her with soft words and promises that everything was fine. But he knew things were far from over. She had asked, with that devastating innocence of a child, if the young woman would be okay, if the bad men would leave her alone now. And Grant had lied and said yes, even though he knew deep down that Riley Carson would probably face retaliation inside the base, that Chad Frazier and his friends were not the type of people who forgot public humiliations. After tucking Emma into bed, softly singing the lullaby she loved and waiting until sleep overcame her fear, Grant went out to the back porch of the house, holding a cup of cold coffee and looking at the stars that could barely pierce the thick fog. He knew he had crossed a line that afternoon, and that now he would have to deal with the consequences. The phone rang close to midnight, the sharp sound cutting through the silence of the house like a blade. Grant answered on the second ring, immediately recognizing Riley's tense voice on the other end of the line, whispering urgently that they knew where she lived, that they had gone to her apartment, that they were waiting outside. Grant felt his blood run cold in his veins, that familiar sensation of adrenaline mixed with controlled anger that he had experienced hundreds of times on past missions. He asked if she had locked all the doors, if she had a weapon, if she had called the police, and the answers came back quick and scared. Yes. Number. It wouldn't help because they were Marines and no one would believe her against the three of them. Grant took a deep breath, looking toward the dark hallway where Emma was sleeping, torn between the instinct to protect his daughter by staying home and the moral duty to help someone who was in direct danger because of his intervention. He told Riley not to open the door for anyone, that he was coming, and hung up before she could protest. Grant called the elderly neighbor who sometimes watched Emma when he needed to go out at night, waiting impatiently while the phone rang and rang, until the woman's sleepy voice finally answered. He quickly explained that he had an emergency, that he needed to leave for a few hours, and she agreed without asking many questions, knowing Grant as a reliable man and a good father. 15 minutes later, with the neighbor sitting on the living room sofa and Emma still sleeping soundly, Grant grabbed his truck keys and left into the night, driving through the empty streets of the town toward the apartment complex where Riley lived. The place was near the base, one of those simple, cheap buildings that were always rented by low-ranking military personnel, with thin walls and neighbors who had learned not to ask too many questions. Grant parked a few blocks away, preferring to approach on foot to assess the situation without being noticed, and it was then that the old reflexes began to take over completely. He moved through the shadows with an ease that would scare anyone who knew him only as the quiet father from the diner, his body automatically remembering the years of training as an Army Ranger, how to tread without making noise, how to use the darkness as an ally, how to assess threats before they were perceived. Grant saw the Marines truck parked in front of Riley's building, recognizing the vehicle from the diner, and counted 3 silhouettes leaning against the hood, smoking and laughing softly, blocking the entrance to her ground-floor apartment. They weren't expecting resistance. That was clear from their relaxed posture, from the way they occupied the space with that arrogance of those who have always had power and have never been truly challenged. Grant felt that internal change happen, that mental click that separated the civilian man from the military operator, and for the first time in years, he didn't try to fight it. Riley needed help, and he was the only one who could provide it. Grant approached from the side of the building, keeping out of the Marine's field of vision, and took his cell phone out of his pocket, calling Riley and whispering clear instructions. She should turn off all the lights in the apartment, lock herself in the bathroom, and not come out until he said it was safe. Then he hung up and put the phone away, taking a deep breath and feeling every muscle in his body prepare for what was coming next. He didn't want violence, never did, but he knew how to recognize when words wouldn't be enough, when the only language certain men understood was force. Grant emerged from the shadows and walked directly toward the group, without haste but with clear purpose, and it took a few seconds until Chad noticed his approach and stopped laughing, turning around with that expression of irritated surprise of someone who didn't expect to be interrupted. Chad recognized Grant immediately, and the arrogant smile returned to his face, that expression that said he had expected exactly this, that perhaps he even wished for a confrontation on more private ground, away from the eyes of the town. Jace and Austin moved away from the truck, forming that same semicircle configuration they had used in the diner, but this time there were no civilian witnesses, no police officer nearby, nothing to contain the escalation. Chad asked with irony if the civilian hero had come to save the damsel again, if he thought he could order Marines around even being outside any chain of command, if he knew that interfering in internal military matters could bring serious trouble. Grant didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning the environment: empty street, dark windows, no sign of witnesses. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, lower but carrying a type of authority that made even Jace hesitate for a second. Grant said a single sentence, calm but definitive like a sentence. "You're going to leave now, or I'll make you leave." The simplicity of the declaration contrasted with the complexity of the implicit threat, and Chad laughed loudly, turning to his friends as if he expected them to also find it hilarious, a middle-aged civilian threatening 3 trained Marines. That was his mistake. Grant moved before Chad finished, turning his face back, closing the distance between them with surprising speed and applying a disarmament and immobilization technique that put the Marine on his knees on the ground in less than 3 seconds, without punching, without visible brutality, just absolute control and surgical precision. Jace reacted first, advancing with a raised fist, but Grant released Chad and dodged the blow with irritating ease, redirecting the Marine's movement and using his own momentum to unbalance him against the building wall. Austin, seeing his two friends neutralized so quickly, hesitated for a fatal second before deciding to attack. And that second was all Grant needed to assess the movement, anticipate the attack, and respond with a block followed by an arm twist that made Austin scream in pain and fall next to Chad, who was still trying to catch his breath. It was all so fast, so efficient, so absolutely disproportionate in terms of skill that the three Marines lay on the ground looking up at Grant with a mixture of shock and fear, finally understanding that they had completely underestimated who he was. Grant remained standing, his breathing controlled, not a hair out of place, and the difference between him and the three clumsy young men on the ground was stark. It wasn't a matter of strength or youth. It was a matter of real training, of genuine combat experience, of years living in environments where hesitating for a second meant dying. Chad slowly stood up, the arrogance replaced by something more cautious, more dangerous anger mixed with humiliation. He spat on the ground and asked who the hell Grant really was, and Grant answered with a neutral voice that it didn't matter, that the only important thing was that they never approach Riley Carson again, never threaten her again, never even look in her direction. He said that if they did it again, he would return, and next time he wouldn't be so gentle. The threat hung in the damp night air, heavy and real, and for the first time Chad seemed genuinely uncertain about what to do, his bravado deflated by the clear demonstration that Grant operated on a completely different level. Jace and Austin were already getting up and walking toward the truck, clearly wanting to get out of there, and after a few tense seconds, Chad followed them, but not without shooting one last look at Grant that promised that this was not over. After the truck disappeared into the fog, Grant waited a few minutes in silence, making sure they were really gone, before calling Riley and telling her she could come out. She appeared at the apartment door with red eyes from crying, still trembling, and thanked him with a broken voice, asking how he had done that, who he really was. Grant just smiled tiredly and said he had served, that he had training, that she didn't need to worry about the details. But Riley was smarter than she seemed, and her eyes scanned Grant with new understanding, finally recognizing the posture, the precision, the kind of presence that only elite operators carried. She whispered, more to herself than to him, that Grant had been a ranger, and he neither confirmed nor denied it. Just told her to lock the door well, notify her superior officer on the base, and consider moving apartments. Then he turned and walked back to his truck, feeling the weight of the night and knowing that he had just revealed a part of himself that he swore to keep buried forever. Grant woke up before dawn with a weight in his chest that had nothing to do with physical fatigue, but with the absolute certainty that things were about to escalate irreversibly. Emma was still sleeping soundly in the next room, hugging her teddy bear, unconscious of the storm forming around their lives. He had spent half the night awake, sitting on the porch, mentally reliving the confrontation with the Marines, knowing that Chad Frazier was not the type of person who would accept humiliation without retaliation. Grant knew how these things worked within the young military mentality. Wounded ego turned into obsession, and obsession led to increasingly stupid and dangerous decisions. He had expected some kind of response, but he didn't imagine it would come so fast, or so directly into his personal life. When he saw the familiar truck parked in front of his house, with the three Marines leaning against the hood, waiting with that posture of those who had all the time in the world, Grant felt his stomach churn, not from fear, but from pure anger that they had brought this close to Emma. He walked out the front door before they could ring the doorbell or make noise that would wake his daughter, closing the door behind him with deliberate care and walking to the middle of the yard, placing himself between them and the house where Emma was sleeping. Chad smiled when he saw him, that kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, loaded with the promise of violence and a thirst for revenge. Jace and Austin flanked the leader, both visibly more nervous than in the previous confrontation. likely having been convinced to be there against their better instincts after having experienced firsthand what Grant was capable of. The morning light painted everything in shades of gray and orange, and Grant could hear the birds beginning to sing in the surrounding trees, an absurdly peaceful contrast to the tension that charged the air. Chad said something about how Grant had made a grave mistake interfering in military matters, that he had humiliated Marines in public and in private, and that now he would have to learn a lesson about respect. Grant didn't answer immediately, his eyes assessing the situation with clinical precision. 3 young, strong men, basic Marine Corps training but no real combat experience, driven by ego and anger more than strategy. They had come armed with group courage, and probably some liquid courage too, judging by the slight sway in Austin's posture. Grant calculated distances, angles of attack, and possible responses to every move they might make. Part of him, the civilized part, the part that was a father and tried to live in peace, still wanted to find a verbal way out, a way to diffuse the situation without violence. But another part, the one that had been forged in years of operations, in places where hesitation meant death, that part knew that the time for words had passed. They had come to his house, had indirectly threatened his daughter just by being there, and that crossed a line that could not be ignored. It was then that Grant heard the window of Emma's room open, and his heart stopped for a second as he realized she had woken up and was looking out, seeing everything. He turned his head slightly, just enough to make eye contact with his daughter, and saw fear and confusion in those brown eyes that trusted him above all else. Grant firmly gestured for her to close the window and stay inside, using that father's tone of voice that allowed no argument, and after a moment of hesitation, Emma obeyed, disappearing back into the room, but probably still looking through the gap in the curtain. Grant's anger multiplied exponentially. They had made Emma witness this, had brought a threat to the only place where she should feel absolutely safe. When he looked back at Chad, there was something new in his eyes, something that made even the arrogant Marine take an involuntary step back. Grant spoke in a low voice but loaded with a deadly promise, saying that they had exactly 5 seconds to get into the truck and leave, or he would do something they would all regret. Chad laughed, but the sound came out forced, fake, and Grant saw Jace look nervously at Austin, both clearly wanting to reconsider the situation. But Chad's ego was bigger than his instinct for survival, and he took the first step toward Grant, fists clenched, saying that this time it would be 3 against 1 and the outcome would be different. That was his mistake. Grant didn't wait for Chad to get close. He closed the distance first, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for someone his age, and before Chad could raise his arms in defense, Grant had already applied a precise blow to the solar plexus that knocked all the air out of the Marine's lungs, followed by an arm twist that put Chad on his knees on the dew-soaked ground. Jace reacted instinctively, advancing with a right hook that would have worked against an ordinary civilian, but Grant dodged with minimal movement, redirected Jace's arm, and used his own momentum to unbalance him, making him fall face first onto the lawn. Austin, seeing his 2 friends neutralized in seconds, hesitated fatally before deciding to attack, and Grant took advantage of that hesitation to close the distance and apply an arm lock that made Austin scream in pain and fall next to Chad. Everything had taken less than 15 seconds from start to finish, and the 3 Marines were on the ground, disarmed and neutralized, while Grant remained standing, his breathing controlled, without a drop of sweat on his forehead. The difference in level was absurd, stark, humiliating for them. It was like watching a martial arts master dealing with first lesson students. Grant crouched down to Chad's level, holding him by the collar of his shirt and forcing eye contact, and when he spoke his voice was so cold that even the birds seemed to stop singing for a moment. He said that this was the last time, that if they returned, if they approached him or Emma or Riley Carson again, he wouldn't be gentle, he wouldn't be controlled, and they would discover exactly what an ex-Army Ranger was capable of doing when someone threatened the people he protected. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, And Grant saw the exact moment Chad finally understood who he had provoked. Saw real fear replacing the arrogance. Saw the realization that they had catastrophically underestimated the situation. Grant let go of Chad with a shove that made him fall onto his back, and ordered the three of them to get into the truck and disappear before he changed his mind about being civilized. They obeyed this time, Jason Austin practically running to the vehicle, Chad following more slowly, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity, but clearly shaken. The truck sped away with the tires squealing on the asphalt, and Grant remained standing in the middle of the yard, watching until they disappeared completely from sight, feeling the adrenaline start to subside and be replaced by deep exhaustion. He had crossed the line again, had completely revealed who he was, and knew that the consequences of that would spread far beyond that confrontation. He turned toward the house and saw Emma at the window, looking at him with that mixed expression of admiration and fear that broke his heart, because he had sworn she would never have to see that side of him, never have to know what he was capable of when there was no more room for words. Grant went into the house and straight up to Emma's room, finding her sitting on the bed, hugging her teddy bear, tears streaming down her cheeks. He sat down next to her and pulled her into a tight hug, whispering apologies, saying he never wanted her to see that he was just protecting their family. Emma asked in a small, scared voice if he had hurt those men, and Grant answered honestly that no, he had only stopped them from hurting someone, that sometimes adults need to be firm to protect those they love. She was quiet for a long moment, processing, and then asked if he was a soldier, and Grant felt his chest tighten as he replied yes, that he had been, but that now he was just her father, and that nothing else mattered but keeping her safe. Emma nodded, still scared but trusting him, and Grant knew that Day had changed something fundamental between them. She had seen the truth, and there was no way to undo that. 2 hours later, while Emma was at school, and Grant was trying to process everything that had happened, drinking cold coffee in the silent kitchen, the phone rang. It was Officer Mercer, with a tense and urgent voice, saying they needed to talk, that something big was happening on the base, that Grant's name had been mentioned at levels much higher than expected. Grant felt a chill run down his spine. Knowing exactly what that meant, Chad had reported the confrontations to his superiors, likely inflating and distorting the facts, and now the military machine was waking up to investigate who the civilian was who had neutralized trained Marines with such ease. Grant thanked Mercer for the warning and hung up, standing in the middle of the kitchen, looking out the window at the quiet street of the town he had chosen to rebuild his life in. He knew the peace was over, that there was no turning back, and that very soon he would have to face consequences he had been running from for years. But when he thought of Emma, of Riley, of doing the right thing despite the cost, Grant knew he would do it all again exactly the same way. The sun was high in the sky when the black sedan with Army license plates parked in front of Grant's house, as discreet as an official vehicle could be on a quiet residential small-town street. Grant had seen the approach from the living room window, and something in his chest tightened. It wasn't fear, but a complex mix of resignation and anticipation, because he knew exactly what that car meant. Emma was at school, safe and away from anything that might happen, and that was the only thing that mattered at that moment. He watched 2 men get out of the vehicle, a driver who remained by the car and another, who walked with impeccable posture toward the front door, wearing an Army dress uniform with Brigadier General stars shining under the sunlight. Grant took a deep breath, smoothed the simple shirt he was wearing, and opened the door before the visitor could ring the doorbell, facing the direct, penetrating gaze of General James Harrington. The general didn't smile, but there was something on his face that wasn't hostility. It was assessment, curiosity, and perhaps even a touch of respect. He formally introduced himself, even though both knew it wasn't necessary, and asked permission to enter and talk in private. Grant nodded and stepped away from the door, letting the officer pass, noticing how Harrington discreetly assessed the interior of the house, the photos of Emma on the walls, the toys organized in the corner of the room, The deliberate simplicity of someone who had chosen to live with the bare minimum. They sat in silence for a few seconds, Grant on the sofa and the general in the armchair opposite, and the weight of the conversation that was about to happen hung in the air like a storm cloud. Harrington began by saying he had come personally because the situation was delicate, because it involved civilians and military personnel, because Grant's name had appeared in reports that had climbed the chain of command very quickly, raising questions that needed answers. Grant didn't say anything initially, just observed the general with that trained calm of someone who had faced much more intense interrogations in much more dangerous places. Harrington continued, explaining that 3 Marines had reported physical confrontations with a civilian who demonstrated advanced military skills, who neutralized the 3 with surprising ease, and that when they investigated who this civilian was, they discovered a record that had been partially classified for years. The general paused, letting the information settle, and then asked directly if Grant was Grant Walker, former Army Ranger, veteran of multiple operations in combat zones, holder of several decorations, including a Silver Star that had never been publicly recognized due to the nature of the missions. Grant kept his face neutral, but nodded slightly, confirming without words what both already knew to be true. Harrington leaned forward, his hands clasped, and said he had read Grant's complete dossier, the missions, the evaluations, the reasons why he had left active service. The general said he understood that men like Grant carried burdens that civilians would never comprehend, and that the decision to choose fatherhood over a military career was respectable, not shameful. But then the tone changed slightly, becoming more formal, more official, and Harrington explained that regardless of Grant's past, assaulting active military personnel was a serious matter that could have complex legal consequences. Grant finally spoke for the first time, his voice calm but firm, saying that he hadn't assaulted anyone. He had defended a junior Marine who was being intimidated and threatened by colleagues, and that he had acted in self-defense when those same Marines came to his house to pose a direct threat to his family. The general studied Grant for a long moment, those experienced eyes reading every micro-expression, every muscle tension, assessing whether he was hearing truth or an elaborate excuse. Harrington then said something Grant didn't expect, that he had spoken personally with Riley Carson, that he had heard her version of events, and that he had found a pattern of problematic behavior involving Chad Frazier and his group, multiple previous complaints that had been minimized or ignored by the local chain of command. The general admitted, with surprising honesty, that the internal culture of the Marine Corps had toxic areas that needed to be corrected, that young Marines sometimes abused institutional power, and that civilians rarely had the courage to intervene due to a justified fear of retaliation. He said that what Grant had done protecting someone vulnerable, risking his own peace to do the right thing, was exactly the kind of action that military personnel should admire, not punish. Grant felt something ease in his chest, a tension he had carried since the first confrontation in the diner, but he remained cautious, knowing that generals didn't come personally just to offer praise. Harrington confirmed this suspicion in the next instant, saying that despite personally respecting Grant's actions, there was institutional pressure to take some kind of action, that the Marine Corps was demanding consequences, that local politicians were concerned about civil-military relations in the town. The general paused, letting the weight of the words settle, and then offered something unexpected. He said he had the authority to file the Marines' reports as exaggerated and motivated by personal humiliation, that he could guarantee that no formal charges would be filed against Grant, but in return, he needed something. Grant asked directly what it was, and Harrington smiled for the first time, a small but genuine smile, and said he wanted Grant to consider coming back, not for full active service, but to work as an instructor, as a mentor for young Rangers who needed to learn not only technical skills, but also moral judgment and control. The offer hung in the air as temptation and test at the same time, and Grant felt 1,000 conflicting emotions clashing inside him. Part of him, the part that had loved the service, that had found purpose and identity in the missions, that missed the camaraderie and the sense of making a difference on a larger scale, that part wanted to accept immediately. But another part, larger and stronger, thought of Emma, of promises made never to leave her, to be present for every birthday and every school recital, to be a father first and anything else later. Grant slowly shook his head, thanking him for the honor of the offer, but firmly refusing, explaining that he had left that life for reasons that were still valid, that Emma needed him whole, not divided between two identities. Harrington nodded without seeming surprised or disappointed, and said he expected exactly that answer, that men of true character always chose family when the choices became impossible. The general stood up to leave, but before going, he said one more thing, that Riley Carson had been transferred to a different unit, far from Chad Frazier and his group, and that the 3 Marines had been formally reprimanded and placed under strict disciplinary observation. He said that Grant's story had circulated discreetly among senior officers, and that now there was renewed respect for the quiet civilian who had done the right thing when everyone else had looked the other way. Harrington extended his hand, and Grant shook it firmly, feeling in that gesture a recognition between equals that transcended ranks or status. The general walked back to the official car, and Grant stood in the doorway watching until the vehicle disappeared around the curve in the street, feeling a strange mixture of relief and melancholy, as if he had definitively closed a chapter, but maintained respect for what that chapter had meant. That afternoon, when Grant went to pick up Emma from school, she ran to him with the luminous smile that made everything worthwhile, jumping into his arms and animatedly telling him about what she had learned that day. As they drove home, Emma was quiet for a moment and then asked, with that sudden seriousness of a child processing big things, if they were safe now, if the bad men wouldn't come back. Grant looked at her in the rearview mirror, seeing absolute trust in those brown eyes, and replied honestly that yes, they were safe, that everything had been resolved. Emma nodded, satisfied, and went back to chattering about recess games, but Grant saw the moment she looked at him with new understanding, as if she had realized something fundamental about who her father was, not just a father, but a protector, a guardian, someone who did the right thing even when it cost dearly. That night, after putting Emma to bed, Grant went out to the back porch and looked at the stars that were finally visible through the fog that had dissipated. He thought about all the choices he had made, from the day he decided to leave the army until the moment he intervened in the diner, and realized that he didn't regret any of them. He had crossed lines he swore not to cross, had revealed identities he preferred to keep hidden, had risked the peace he had worked so hard to build. But he had also taught Emma about real courage, had protected Riley from something that could have destroyed her, had shown an entire community that silence in the face of injustice was complicity. Grant knew with absolute certainty that this was true honor, not the kind that came from medals or ranks, but the kind that came from doing the right thing when no one else would, from protecting those in need when everyone else turned their face, from maintaining integrity even when it cost everything. He smiled lightly at the stars, feeling genuine peace for the first time in days, and went back inside the house where Emma slept safely, knowing that he had finally understood what it meant to be a real man, not because of what he had been, but because of who he had chosen to become.